maybe you've signed up for tournaments or are just participating in some friendly competitive games, but either way, you want to try to get some practice in. What's the best way to do that? Is it ladder? Is it actually finding a practice group and doing mock best of fives? Well, let's talk about the differences and kind of the benefits, pros and cons of each. So, when you're looking at ladder versus playing in a tournament, there are a couple of big differences. Mostly, it's looking at the difference between how many decks you will have to play, or if there are bans being included. In a lot of tournaments, you're going to bring multiple decks, and most likely you will also get to ban one of your opponent's decks. But on ladder, you can't really do that. So, what's the benefit of actually playing on ladder to practice for tournaments then? There is some good and bad with ladder, but let's talk about the fact that, first of all, it's easier to get to for more players. Everyone has access to playing ranked, playing ladder. So maybe not everyone has a practice group to actually be able to practice for upcoming tournaments, but everybody can jump in and at least play some games in ranked and get experience with the decks they plan on bringing. It's also good for just kind of overall deck performance, overall deck practice, overall deck experience. No matter what deck you play on ladder, you're going to get some practice with it, you're going to get experience playing it, and you can start to pick up the win condition of the deck, how you need to play it, your mulligans. You'll get experience and practice with all of that. Now, again, I kind of mentioned this, the not so good thing about ladder for tournament practice is that big arching enemy of bans. Yeah, in tournaments, you're probably going to have to ban. And a lot of decks and even the entire lineup are built with a ban in mind. But on ladder, you can't ban. So if you're trying to practice on ladder for tournaments, just keep that in mind that if you are going to bring some decks or build a lineup to specifically have a ban that you say, I know my decks are not going to do well versus X class, whatever, that's fine. And just keep that in mind when you do your practice. So it will skew your data a little bit if you are looking at that, but it can also be a little bit emotionally draining or tough to actually practice matchups that you expect to see if you see a lot of the deck you're planning on banning. For example, if it's very popular. At one point, Druid was extremely popular on ladder and was getting banned a lot in tournaments. But if you're trying to practice against other decks that you might see in the tournament and all you keep queuing into on ladder is Druid, it's not helping you very much. And the last kind of negative point for practicing on ladder is that sometimes it's not completely reflective of what you will see in a tournament meta. Now, this will vary on what tournament you are playing in. I would say generally the kind of entry-level tournaments will be pretty similar to ladder. It's very easy for players to play on ladder and bring those same decks into a tournament setting, but the more competitive the tournament, the higher up the level goes, or if it's a different type of format, that's when the decks that you face on ladder might not be very helpful. Now, on the flip side, let's talk about if you do have a practice group and you aren't playing on ladder. So, it's kind of the opposite, right? On ladder, you're going to be able to just kind of play whatever, play what you want, test out different stuff. You will have the downside of not being able to do a ban. However, if you're doing some practice best of fives with a group of friends or a practice group, then it's a lot easier to actually practice the entire ban session and say, okay, these are the 3 decks, 2 decks, whatever it might be, that you actually will play as if your opponent, your friend that you're playing against, banned a certain deck, and vice versa. So this gives you a very kind of streamlined actual practice for that tournament. Plus, if you are practicing with other people who are in the competitive scene or who are also going to be competing, it does give you that little bit of edge because that is more likely going to reflect the tournament meta. Whereas on ladder, again, it might not completely reflect the meta that the tournament you're playing in will be. Now, the only caveat I do want to point out with the practice groups and meta relevance is that depending on the size of your practice group, maybe it's only you and one other person practicing, you might start to get that little bit of tunnel vision. And if the two of you think that the meta is going to be a certain way, you're going to practice with that in mind. However, that might not be what the meta actually ends up looking like for the tournament. So depending on how small your practice group is, you might not get that meta read correct, which then makes your practice a little bit more difficult. The bigger the practice group, the more accurate your tournament meta read might be, but at the same time, it might be a little bit too chaotic and all over the place, so it can feel a little bit overwhelming, depending, again, on how large your practice group is. But that's probably going to be a lot more realistic of an experience in terms of the decks you'll face and the actual practice in how your lineup feels coherently than any experience you'll be able to get on ladder. Now, one last kind of caveat and benefit that I want to talk about for actually playing in a practice group or with somebody else to test your specific decks or test a specific lineup is that practice will help you in more specific matchups. So for example, on ladder, you just have to bring the one deck and then practice against whatever you come across. Might not be realistic if you're actually trying to face a certain matchup. For example, if you expect to see a lot of mage in the tournament and you really want to see how a specific deck does against a mage, you might not face it on ladder. And that doesn't help your practice at all. But if you have a practice group or even somebody else to practice a couple of games with, you can actually go in and practice a specific matchup. Or if you even want to increase how well you know a specific matchup, maybe one that you expect to be popular, then practice groups or practice partners make that a lot easier as well. So overall, it's not impossible to get tournament practice on ladder, but it can vary. And if you're looking for more specific practice, a more detailed practice, you will get better results generally with a practice group than purely playing on ladder. Thank you so much for watching this. I hope that you enjoyed, and if you did get any value or you are planning on playing any tournaments, I would love if you could give this video a thumbs up. And for even more tips, tricks, and strategies, make sure you check out the playlist here.